and gentlemen. Today we're talking about using congruent triangles. We've been talking about how to prove triangles congruent. Now we're going to use congruent triangles to prove other things. So, for this particular problem, we're starting with some information, and we're given a diagram. We know C is the midpoint of segment BA, and segment BD is congruent to segment AD. And we're going to use that information to prove that angle B is congruent to angle A, which seems like a large challenge at first because we're used to proving triangles congruent, not corresponding parts congruent. But there's a simple way we can do this. If we start with the end in mind, we know we are trying to prove angle B and angle A are congruent. They're corresponding angles in these two triangles. If I were to take one triangle and flip it over this line to where it lies on top of the other triangle, A and B are corresponding. Well, if I can somehow prove that my two triangles are congruent, then I know my corresponding angles will be as well. So I'm going to try and start proving these two triangles congruent so that I can say my two angles are. So I'm going to start with the information I know. I know that segment BD is congruent to segment AD, and that's given to me. And that's already marked in our picture. I also know that C is the midpoint of segment BA, which is given as well. Since it's the midpoint, I know that these two segments are congruent. So BC is congruent to AC, and that's by the definition of a midpoint. So now I have two pairs of sides congruent. I also have a shared side, DC. And that's using my reflexive property of congruence. And since I know three pairs of corresponding sides are congruent, I can say my two triangles are. So triangle, I'll say this one is BCD is congruent to triangle ACD. ACD, we're making sure our corresponding parts are in the right position. And that's our side congruence postulate. And now, since I know my two triangles are congruent, I can say that angle B and angle A are congruent because corresponding angles of congruent triangles are congruent. I know that in part from the definition of congruent triangles, which says all the corresponding sides and all the corresponding angles are congruent. So again, if I can prove the two triangles congruent, I can say their corresponding parts are, and this is the reason that I would give. So that's an example of using congruent triangles to prove that angles or sides are congruent to each other. Let's do a second example. We'll do a total of 3 for this short video. For this problem, I'm trying to prove that angle A is congruent to angle C. If I can prove these two triangles congruent, I can say the angles are. Well, first of all, I'm given two pairs of sides are congruent. And I know a third pair of sides are congruent because it's shared. And again, that's my reflexive property. Anything is congruent to itself. And so again, like the last example, I have side congruence postulate, which allows me to say that these two triangles are indeed congruent. And since my two triangles are, I can say that these corresponding angles are, because again, this is flipped. If I were to flip this triangle over line BD, it would lie directly on top of this triangle. So, angle A and angle C are corresponding, and they're congruent because corresponding angles of congruent triangles are congruent. It's a long reason, but it needs to be stated. So that's our second proof. Again, here we used side. We won't always use side. Sometimes we'll use side angle side or angle side or something else we've used before. A final example, it's a bit different. And in this case, we're given that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, angle 3 is congruent to angle 4. And we want to prove that these two small triangles here are congruent. And if we examine this, we see that we have a pair of angles and a shared side, but nothing else. And there's nothing else we can really use from our picture. So we can't right off the bat say that those two triangles are. However, if we can show that these two large triangles are congruent, which may be simpler, then we can use the corresponding pieces as more information to prove our small two triangles are. So follow me through this proof, and then we'll recap and review at the end. So we know that these angles are congruent because it's given to us. Angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, and angle 3 is congruent to angle 4. We also know that these two large triangles share this common side, and it would help if I use this. And since they share a common side, we're going to use our reflexive property. So again, that's our reflexive property of congruence because something is congruent to itself. And if we analyze the diagram that we have here, we have a pair of congruent angles, an included side, and another pair of congruent angles. So that looks like we're going to use our angle, side, angle congruence postulate. And that allows us to say that our two large triangles are congruent, which is fantastic and very useful. Since our two large triangles are congruent, we also know that their corresponding parts are congruent. So that allows us to say that CB and CD are congruent. And that's corresponding sides of congruent triangles are congruent. And that allows us to use it as information for showing that these two small triangles are congruent. So now we have a pair of angles in our two small triangles. We have a pair of sides in our two small triangles. And again, we have a shared side using our reflexive property. So we can say we have another pair of sides here. So it looks a lot like side, angle, side. Side, angle, side. So now we can prove our two small triangles congruent by the side, angle, side congruence postulate. So to kind of recap this, we showed our two large triangles were congruent first, so we could use these corresponding sides to show that our two small ones were, because we didn't have enough information at the beginning. So it can be helpful to prove a different set of triangles are congruent in order to use corresponding parts to show that the actual two you want to prove are congruent. So those are a few examples that can possibly help you with section 4.6 using congruent triangles. So hopefully it's helpful, and we can take a look at it more later.